Okay, biology students, this is for chapter 16.1 through 16.3. And it's not very colorful, I'm sorry. I'm going to show you a few videos in class. All right, so 16.1 talks about essentially the history of a concept called evolution and how it came to be. So evolution is just how modern organisms are believed to have changed over time and come from a common ancestor. Think of an ancestor like a great-grandparent or something. So essentially, all of organisms on Earth are to have been descended from some common ancestor. So Charles Darwin is the person who developed this theory of evolution in 1831. Okay, he took a voyage on 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 a ship called the Beagle. And he made many observations on this trip, kind of like a trip around, not the world, but he went to many different places, including the Galapagos Islands. So he noticed a lot of different variations in his observations in species, and most of those took place on an island called the Galapagos Islands. Okay. So some things he noticed. He noticed biodiversity. The species were very different. He noticed that the species varied locally, globally, and over time. Species varied and over time. Okay, and how he came to these observations. So for example, globally, there are some flightless ground-dwelling animals that were similar but unrelated that looked alike. Rheas in South America, ostriches in Africa, and emus in Australia all looked similar, but they were unrelated genetically, not that similar. And the reason why they looked similar is because they have a similar habitat. He also noticed that species varied locally. In the Galapagos Island, he noticed specific species like finches, beetles, and tortoises. And he noticed how they were all different, but they must have been related. And due to their different habitats in that local area. We'll talk more about some of those species. He also noticed that species vary over time, and this was due to his his collection of fossils. So fossils, I've done fossils. And what are fossils? They are remains or traces of ancient organisms. Okay. So that's kind of about the history of Darwin. 16.2 is about the scientists that influenced Darwin's thinking. Any scientist who does any kind of research, they read up on other scientists' research, trying to learn about what they're doing that maybe can help their research, etc. And these following people, Lyell, Hunt, and Lamarck, and Malthus, were geologists, scientists, and economists that influenced Darwin's development of his evolutional theory. So Lyell, if you want to draw an arrow here, in 1785 did his work, and Hutton in 1830 were both geologists that determined through their work that pretty much The age of the Earth is old. Okay, so they were geologists. Now, you might think, well, we've known that for forever, haven't we? Or, you've learned that before, that the age of the Earth is old. But in Darwin's time, that was a brand new idea. And how they determined this is by studying the geology of the Earth and determined that the Earth's forces have changed the surface of the Earth very slowly over a long period of time. And that the same laws in nature are still going on today, known as gradualism. So that was new, and that influenced Darwin. Lamarck in 1809 did his work, and he also influenced Darwin. He was a scientist that determined, or that thought that acquired traits were passed to offspring. I spelled acquired wrong, didn't I? So he did, he thought that, for example, if you didn't use a body part, or if you did use a body part as an animal, you could pass that trait down or not pass that trait down. Acquired traits are traits that you acquire during your lifetime. To put it in terms that you might be able to understand, like if I acquire the trait of being able to play the piano, so I'm a piano player, he thought that that acquired trait could then be passed on to my offspring if I acquired that trait, okay? So he had this idea of traits being passed down to the offspring. Malthus was an economist in 1798 who did his work, and kind of interesting, he was an economist that noticed that places in Europe were getting very crowded, and he noticed that kind of like the standard of living was being lowered. So he thought that if the human population grows unchecked, grows unchecked, meaning nothing to control it, there will not be enough food or space for everyone. So essentially, something is going to have to stop human growth or any kind of organism growth. Okay. That led Darwin to develop his theory, known as, part of his theory called artificial selection, and or another name for selective I shouldn't say this. This is not Darwin's theory. This is related to his theory. Artificial selection is when nature provides the traits my picture keeps freezing, sorry. The variations, for example, green pod color versus yellow pod color, but humans select those that are useful. So in terms of dog, a dog that yaps all the time and a dog that is pleasantly reserved and quiet. You could breed the dogs for that trait of being quiet and reserved rather than yippy. That is artificial selection, when nature has these variations, but humans select and breed based on what trait they find most desirable. So dog breeders, horse for speed. You can breed horses for speed. Farmers select cows producing the most milk, etc. Selective breeding. Darwin published his book on Origin of Species. Darwin book published in 1859. Okay, and it combined his ideas along with his influence from Malthus and Lamarck and those other scientists. Now there was another scientist named Alfred Wallace that was kind of doing similar work, and he kind of had to hurry up and publish it so he would get credit for it. Darwin was also worrying about being criticized because he had some ideas that were pretty controversial to the time. So Darwin noticed that there was a struggle for existence going on. So you can, yeah. So he knew because of the struggle in existence, and this is not just humans, other organisms as well, there will be competition for food, space, mates, and shelter. Okay? Because that's the struggle for existence. So more individuals than can survive, okay? More individuals produce than can survive. So there's going to have to be a fight for these things that people need. And he came up with this struggle for existence after reading that economist work, Malthus. He also noticed these adaptations that some organisms had that made them better to or more able to survive. An adaptation, so let's go here. An adaptation makes an organism more fit in an environment. So some organisms had adaptations that made them better able to survive than others. It's called an adaptation. The heritable part it means you can inherit them. The ability of me to play the piano cannot be inherited, but my height I can give to my kids, and that might make me more likely to survive and reproduce. Right down here after adaptation, some variations are better suited to life in their environment than others. Just kind of depends. Now this is the method or mechanism for Darwin's evolution. It's called natural selection. Another name for this is survival of the fittest. Okay? It's Darwin's mechanism for evolution. The reason why evolution works is because this concept of natural selection. It's kind of like artificial, except in this case, nature is the one that's picking the traits that it wants. Fitness, again, not like physically fit, is just how well an organism can survive and reproduce in its environment. How well it can survive and reproduce. There can be high fitness, well suited to their environment, so more likely to survive and reproduce. Low fitness is not well suited, not likely to survive and reproduce. So in terms of finches, in which Darwin actually did a lot of work with his finches or observations, these are all different species of finches that Darwin saw on the Galapagos Island. So an example of different fitness levels was with beak shape and mating songs. So the shape of a beak of a bird could make it more fit or less fit to an environment depending on what kind of food was available. There are 3 conditions for natural selection that need to happen in order for nature to select the traits that are more favorable. There needs to be some kind of struggle for existence. Essentially, there needs to be not enough food or not enough space or something. More organisms are produced than can survive, okay? There needs to be some variations in the organisms. They can't all look the same. And these adaptations need to be able to make an organism more likely to survive and reproduce compared to another one. There needs to be a difference there. And there needs to be a struggle or survival of the fittest. Well-adapted individuals need to survive and reproduce better than others. This brings us to our last concept for 16.3, and it has to do with this kind of like this finch tree. This is the common ancestor of all of these different species of finches. It's the common descent principle, and it states that all species, living and extinct, are descended from an ancient common ancestors. So, and it looks like, or another name for it is the tree of life. So this is a tree with just finches. Like in terms of humans, we're descended from our parents, who are descended from their parents, who descended from their parents, etc., 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 etc. It goes back over time, and as time went on, okay, organisms have changed. There's been different adaptations. Environments have changed to make a trait or an adaptation more desirable than others, and this influence essentially evolution or natural selection.